Okay, great. So nice to get the chance to talk to you. So my talk will, I guess, be a bit, I'm also going to talk about Canada, so I guess it's going to be a bit complementary to what Normand said. So my title is Where Next for Canada's Low Carbon Transition. So I'm going to really use it as occasion to give a little bit of reflection about where we've been and where we need to go. So I'm going to talk briefly then, it'll be organized around these three headings: the Canadian context, difficulties with the current debate, and some challenges for the coming period. And obviously, for those of you who are really up on the climate change debates and so on, some of the things that I'm going to say, you're going to say, oh, well, that's old hat. But nevertheless, I think some of them are maybe important to remember in any case. So I'll start with the Canadian context. So a bit like Normand, I think it's really important to understand what's happening in the EU and be inspired by the EU example, or particularly the examples of some leading countries within the EU. But also, it's really important to just remember some of the ways in which Canada is very different from most EU countries and quite peculiar. So the first thing is we're drowning in energy. So we have everything that you could want from uranium and every kind of fossil fuel, potential for renewables, wind, solar, tidal, geothermal, and so on, and biomass from coast to coast. So we're an energy-rich country. We've had a carbon-intensive development trajectory. So what that basically means is since the 1800s, we have built an economy that relies on the fact that we have cheap, abundant resources and lots of space. And that's just really different than the old European countries like the UK or Germany, which are much smaller territorially and have used up a lot of their natural resources a long time ago. And of course, that trajectory is fantastic. It's made us, given us competitive industries and so on, and yet it's a bit of a problem in a carbon-constrained world. We have very differentiated regional political economies, so there's much more difference within the Canadian provinces in terms of their energy political economies, really, than there is within all the different states of the European Union. We also have decentralized constitutional arrangements, which in some ways are actually, in some respects, more decentralized than what you have within the European Union, or at least we have institutional gaps that aren't there in some aspects within the EU. So all of these things make something like climate change policy and the energy transition really difficult. And we're closely integrated economically with the United States, which is an advantage. It's nice to have the big, rich market close to us. On the other hand, as we see with the recent NAFTA kerfuffle, it can be a problem if you're completely dependent on one country for your trade. But it's also that the US is the developed country that seems to have the most kind of schizophrenic relationship with climate change. And there is no doubt that the change in US policies spill over into Canada. They spill over economically, and they also spill over ideologically. So all of these things make climate change policy and the energy transition different. And it's just, keep in mind when Normand says how screwed up we are, and I agree with his thing, we have to remember also what is some of these factors that are really acting. Okay, so that's kind of the structural circumstances. So just on the political history, so we've had a long history of trying to engage with climate change, but difficulty in actually, particularly at the federal level, doing policies that actually have teeth. We have recently a long history, well, actually a long history of contentious energy politics, but most recently the whole pipeline arguments, but those aren't the only infrastructure that it's hard to build right now. We've got arguments over big hydro and even substantial anti-wind movements, particularly in Ontario. Provincial initiatives which we've had, like the Ontario coal phase-out, the BC carbon tax, Quebec, and then later Ontario cap and trade systems. So it's not that nothing is happening, particularly the provinces took up leadership in the Harper period when nothing much was happening on the federal level. And more recently, the Pan-Canadian framework, for which it has all these holes in terms of actual implementation that Normand pointed out. On the other hand, politically, it nevertheless represents something of movement in actually getting the provinces and the federal government within a general framework at a carbon backstop price and a certain number of complementary policies that the feds are still working on. So within this context, I'd like to just talk briefly about some of the problems with the debates as they've been structured over the last 5 years or so on, and even into the new government, which I think are complementary to some of the remarks that Normand made. So the first thing is that the debate remains still a question about a relatively short-term focus on funding megatons of CO2 reduction. And if you spoke to people in the federal government who were working around the pan-Canadian framework, they were kind of running around it. And this is not to criticize the good work that they did, but saying, oh, where can we find an extra 12 megatons? Or can we get an extra 7 over here or something like this? And 2030 is, 2020 is a ridiculous framework to be thinking about. 2030 is more reasonable. But 2050, kind of mid-century, is where we're aiming at. And things have to, in a sense, we really need to think more strategically and not just be wrapped up. And this is not just a criticism of the federal government. This is a criticism of how the debate, even with NGOs, is often formulated about, oh, we have a target for this day. Oh, how many tons can we get? And can we get another number of tons there? Which is not an argument against quantified analysis. It's an argument about how we conceive what the goals of what we're trying to do is. Second thing is, endless, Canada really has to win the prize, maybe Australia's up there too, internationally for this debate on carbon pricing, which just never goes away. It's like, I don't know, a bad hangover or the flu or something. Every time you kind of think it gets settled, some politician pedals back and says, oh, well, I don't believe in cap and trade, I would do a carbon price. But if there's a carbon price, you can be sure some politicians say, oh, well, I think the cap and trade would be better. So it started off, nobody wanted to hear it. But first, carbon pricing was the flavor of the month, then nobody wanted to hear it, then other things got measured and people said, oh, well, carbon pricing is better than these regular, and we go round and round and round. So this is not just a criticism of politicians, it's also, again, the way the transition has been framed, and partly because the conversation has been dominated by economists who kind of present the idea, well, if we could just get the carbon price right, other things would all unfold. But there are all sorts of structural reasons why it's impossible to get the carbon price right. Carbon pricing, I'm not denouncing it, it's an important thing, it's a good measure that we've actually done it, but it is not, in my opinion, going to be carbon pricing that is the critical lever to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. So, another point. For most Canadians, the low carbon transition is like, what? You joked that your parents wondered what kind of gas you were worrying about or something. So NRCan has recently done this thing on generation energy, which is it's encouraged, it's good they do an outreach to the public and so on, but it has not penetrated ordinary Canadians. The people who participated were really the same old suspects, a little bit bigger, people who were really into the energy debate from energy companies and universities and things like that. At some point, that needs to penetrate more into the public consciousness, and there are certainly other OECD countries where it's much more clearly understood than Canada. And critically, the discussion on emissions reductions has been largely isolated from the conversation about how do we meet societal needs and development pathways. So the low carbon transition is not a question of toting up emissions reductions. I mean, that's obviously important, but it's about finding ways to build an economy that meets social needs, that promotes the values that people have, while also being carbon neutral over the coming decades. The last thing I put down here is difficulties with the debates, federal-provincial conflict and the politicization of this debate. I put them in square brackets because I don't think there are difficulties with the present debate. That is the reality of the nature of what the low carbon transition, how it's going to work in Canada. In other words, there is no way away from federal provincial tensions on these things because they're built into the structure of the Constitution, but also the political economy that exists in different parts of Canada. So it's a question of learning how to manage and deal with those issues, not a question of thinking we can walk away from it. And I say the same about politicization, because it may be possible and it's necessary to build a consensus around certain things at certain points of time. But all that means is that there are other things that will be the object, that will be exploited in politics, that will be the object of political argument and so on. So all you have to do is look at how historical transitions have taken place in energy systems. I don't know, the death of horse-drawn vehicles and the rise of the motor car. Politics runs through it completely. Each side tries to get politics, mobilize resources, get laws, get regulations, taxes shifted to their side. So there's no way to completely get away from this. This is just the landscape within which we'll be working over the next, half century or whatever. So briefly, some challenges for the next period. I put institution building. Here I mean a lot of the things Normand mentioned. So we need, for instance, the UK has this thing called the UK Climate Commission, which provides independent advice to Parliament. They have a system of a 5-year running carbon budgets. This is kind of independent from everyday politics. So we need some sort of monitoring, evaluation, expert advice provision structure. And there are other things that we need in terms of low carbon institutions. We still need policy development. Areas that are under discussion but that would be important would be things like stuff on vehicles, stuff on housing, perhaps a zero emission vehicle standard or low carbon fuel standards. Brief word on why does the personal transport sector matter. So Normand mentioned that we're 80% decarbonized our electricity system in Canada already. That's very good comparatively internationally, and yet still we have some of the highest per capita emissions in the world, which shows you how problematic our other sectors are. So I'm not saying we can forget about electricity, but I'm saying the electricity battle, it's clear what has to be done, though vastly increasing electricity production while continuing to do it in a decarbonized way is going to be a challenge. But the center of gravity in Canada and also internationally is shifting to other battles. And in this one, I think, crudely put, the electrification of transport is the critical one. And it's critical because it's a political, of its political importance. Because of its potentially to structurally weaken the oil industry, the fossil industry. So let me put it very crudely. Coal is dead in Canada. I'm not saying all coal plants have been phased out and they will limp on, but they're not significant. Oil is significant. There's the question of oil for export, and then there's the question of our everyday use of oil for transport. So we are within reach of a cusp of a movement in the transport system towards electrification. Some countries have begun to actually fix dates for the phase out of sale of internal combustion or gasoline or diesel powered engines. The dates are still quite far away for most countries, but that doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned. It's the psychological thing of saying, after a certain point, this is a dead-end technology. You should stop investing in this. Invest in the technologies of the future. So Norway's already got about 30% of new vehicle sales are either electric or hybrid, not the fleet, but sales. And they ridiculously subsidize it. I mean, it's unbelievable, all the subsidies. And yet, imagine in Canada if a third of all car sales were electric vehicles. It's going to tip the politics as well as the kind of emissions from those tailspikes. That's why I disagree with my economics colleagues who often say, oh, it's ridiculous to waste all this money on subsidies or other supports for electric vehicles because we can get emissions cheaper elsewhere. Yes, we can. Of course we can. But that isn't the point. The point is to accelerate the tipping point. So I was just lecturing early this morning and showing classes these S-curves for all these technologies, from electricity to washing machines and so on, since 1900. And all these curves, every single one is an S-curve. There is not a single one that's a flat curve with over 30 years, 2% is gained every year of market share of the new technologies. So I saw this report Exxon published a couple of years back, which showed they talked about the growth of renewables in the energy system. So what they said is, in 2060, renewables are going to supply almost all the electricity needs in Europe and the developed countries. And then they switched to transport fuels. And what do they say? On the transport sector, personal passenger vehicles in 2060 will be 80% powered by carbon-based liquid fuels. Now, of course, it's hard for them to say anything. And they had this graph that went like this over 40 years. I cannot say, and nobody can say, when will electric vehicles achieve decisive penetration. What you can say is, whatever it is, the curve is not going to look like this. It's going to look like that. So, as far as I'm concerned, anything that pushes that curve closer to the present time is important, not just because of the tons of carbon it will save if you do it 10 years later in those 10 years, but also because of the political change it will make in an inward investment into the oil industry, into the acceleration of the development of alternative technologies and so on. Okay, so I went off on a big rant on that. Sorry about that. Very quickly. So public support and engagement, there's some debate today about policy stickiness, because people say, oh my goodness, elections could change, wind could be out in Ontario, conservatives then, Alberta, wow, how can you tell what's going to, can we make policies sticky so they can't be unraveled? Yeah, there are cute things you can do for that. As far as I'm concerned, the only way you really make progress on that is to make it that politicians don't want to undo policies, because the political cost is too great. And to do that, you have to have more public buy-in into the energy transition. I'll say 2 words on these low carbon development pathways. We need to link the low carbon transition to the economic trajectories with which it's associated. It has to be associated with building better, cleaner cities, vibrant economies, and not seen simply as tons of carbon you've got to squeeze out of somebody by a certain date. And the last thing is just a pitch. Canada's headed this way anyway, but I think we could do more deliberate measures to develop regional decarbonization pathways, where we recognize, is not to say the federal doesn't have a role, but these regional pathways will look very different in Alberta than they look in Quebec or they look in Ontario. And well, here's a slide which I'll just leave you with some of the things that developing these regional pathways would include, which basically involves understanding the economic development trajectory of the region, its comparative advantages and disadvantages, which firms, which technologies are critical, how you use the cultural and political resources of the region. So what might work in Alberta with a kind of free enterprise type mentality is different than Quebec and the Cultural Revolution. I mean, the Cultural, that's good. Quiet Revolution and Hydro-Quebec, and so on. So that's one of the things I think where academics could actually help is in engaging to develop some of these regional decarbonization pathway projects.
Thank you.